Good morning and welcome everybody to our session, which is a deep dive on the Voluntary AI Safety Standard. Wonderful to have you along. We have a great session for you here today. My name is Dr. Brett Szmajda. I am the Executive Manager of the National AI Centre, and I'll be your host here today. But we have a number of great panelists also joining us to talk about the Voluntary AI Safety Standard and how you can be implementing safe and responsible AI in your organisation. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we are all joining this call today. I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, around 20 kilometres to the southeast of Melbourne CBD. The country that I'm on was a shared area between two main Wurundjeri clans, the Boonwurrung and the Woiwurrung people. Much like our gathering today, the country I'm on was a place of frequent gatherings between tribes, particularly in springtime. So I'd like to recognise the continuing connection of our First Nations people to land, waters and community, pay my respects to elders past and present, and of course to welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining this call today. If this is your first time joining a National AI Centre webinar, the National AI Centre's mission is to accelerate the positive adoption of an innovation to benefit Australia's business and community. We do this across two major tracks, providing resources and support for responsible AI adoption across industries across Australia, and also to help ensure that we are growing a responsible AI industry across the whole of Australia, so helping our adopters and our developers separately. On the agenda for today, we're going to have three experts join us to do a deeper dive on key elements around, first of all, I will introduce the safety standard and the 10 guardrails for those who haven't had a look at it before this call. And then we'll bring in our experts to talk about international alignment of the standard, the human-centered approach taken and how this is related to the AI ethics principles from 2019, and the importance of moving these principles into practice. Finally, at the end, we will have a panel discussion. Note that the chat function is off, but we are definitely keen to hear questions. You will see a Q&A button at the top of your screen, so use that to pose questions at any point through the webinar. If we don't get the time to answer all the questions today, we will try to loop around to participants later, but please note that all feedback helps us inform the next version of the safety standard. I mentioned those excellent participants. Here they are on this slide here. We'll be joined later on in this call by Liming Zhu, who is Research Director for Software and Computational Systems at Data61 in CSIRO. Myfanwy Wallwork, who is AI Governance Lead at the Human Technology Institute. And Ali Akbari, who is Director of AI Practice at the Gradient Institute. These three organisations and others are part of our Responsible AI Network and were key contributors to the development of the first version of the Voluntary AI Safety Standard. The Responsible AI Network gathers industry experts, industry bodies, training organisations and practitioners to help focus on responsible AI solutions across Australian industry. These are things like best practice tools, resources, webinars like the one you're joining here today, to help our AI practitioners deploy and develop AI in a safe and responsible way. So on with the show. This is just a bit of a quick primer to tell you about how we got to where we are now. So at the start of 2024, the Australian government released its interim response to earlier consultation around safe and responsible AI. This provided a coordinated approach across multiple areas to support the overall objective of developing community trust and promoting AI adoption. This discussion paper proposed a risk-based approach to AI regulation to ensure that low-risk AI could flourish unimpeded, while high-risk uses were subject to appropriate safeguards. You'll note that there's the voluntary and the mandatory guardrails mentioned earlier, but there was also a couple of other areas around the development of voluntary watermarking and labelling of AI-generated material, which is work that we are currently undergoing, and the provision of an expert AI advisory body. So an important question, of course, is to ask, well, what was the incentive? Why do we need this voluntary standard? And recently released by Fifth Quadrant, sponsored by the National AI Centre, is the Responsible AI Index 2024, which really provides the call to action of why we have this. What Fifth Quadrant did is they surveyed AI strategy decision makers from 413 companies across Australia, across a number of areas which you can see down the middle of this slide, aligned with the 8 AI ethics principles. And questions in this survey had one of two sorts of flavors. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the aggregate of questions around what companies thought they were doing in the responsible AI area. And on the right-hand side, you can see questions that really drilled into whether or not they were actually doing responsible AI practice. So to give an example, in the third row here, there's the ethics principle of fairness, and a question related to that people would have answered on the sort of, strongly disagree to strongly disagree kind of scale would be, we have robust systems and processes in place to minimize the likelihood of our AI systems causing unfair treatment of individuals, communities, or groups. And in that case, across all of those questions, 69% of organizations agreed. On the right-hand side would be questions, for example, saying whether or not these companies have actually reviewed their AI algorithms for potential bias and whether or not they strongly agree with that statement. And you can see across all of the questions and all of the areas, there is a large gap between those people who thought that those companies that thought they were performing responsible AI within their companies versus those who are performing responsible AI practices in depth, a 49 percentage point gap. So in order to close the gap, this is why we have brought out the Voluntary AI Safety Standards to provide some guidance to companies. So what is the Voluntary AI Safety Standard? This is a how-to guide, basically, for deployers, which focuses on governance and process steps particularly, so that you can focus on this issue in a whole-of-company manner. The voluntary standard encourages organizations to take proactive steps to identify and mitigate risks across their organization. Noting the first word, it's voluntary. It doesn't create new legal obligations for organizations. I will asterisk that by saying, of course, that existing laws apply to AI, such as privacy and consumer law, and the intersections between these existing laws are called out in the voluntary standard. And of course, please note that the government, as mentioned earlier, is currently reviewing feedback on implementing mandatory guardrails for AI use in high-risk settings. Features of the voluntary standard is that it is aligned with a number of international standards, such as ISO and the National Institute of Science and Technology standards on risk management in AI systems. So the goal is that you've got one set of guidance that you can apply. Pardon me. You've got one set of guidance you can apply, and that will mean that you are aligned with international standards. The first version particularly focuses on deployers of AI systems. So what you can see on this side is a caricatured sketch of the AI lifecycle from build to implementation. We, of course, know that it is not linear. There are loops and folds along the way, but to simplify this down on the top of the slide, you can see. And the first version particularly focusing on the adopters of AI with a scalable approach. So something that can be taken from organizations that have 5 people through to organizations that have 500 people. Version 2, we'll talk about later, is underway, and this is to focus on the left-hand side of the slide, so those people developing AI systems. And the long-term goal is, with this voluntary standard that we'll keep iterating, is to establish transparency and accountability throughout and across the supply chain. Before I throw to our excellent panelists, I'll just give you a quick run-through of the 10 guardrails themselves. So what you can see on this slide is a high-level view of what is underneath the first guardrail in the voluntary standard. Guardrail 1 is around helping you set up the required accountability processes to guide your organization's safe and responsible use of AI, which includes an overall owner for AI use, an AI strategy, and any training for relevant people within your organization. Underneath this are things like key concepts that this point is trying to drive home, actionable steps that you can take, how this maps to the AI ethics principles, and particular guidance on working with suppliers. So things that you might incorporate into your contracts, for example. As far as the remainder of the guardrails, so guardrail number 2 talks about how are you assessing and mitigating risks of AI systems. The risks of AI systems often depend on the use case of that system, and these risks can evolve over time, particularly as users become more familiar with the systems, and sometimes they get complacent. So the standard includes some questions that you can ask to determine whether the use, context, data, or other factors might increase risk. Guardrail number 3 focuses on what data governance and security controls you have in place. This includes managing data quality, putting controls around personally identifiable and sensitive data, or ensuring that you have appropriate cybersecurity provisions to address risks associated with your AI systems. Oh, we have navigated to the next set of standards. Sorry about that. Guardrail 4 regards testing and monitoring to ensure that you have appropriate processes and governance in place to document what your acceptable criteria are for AI systems, and to regularly test your AI models and systems in an ongoing fashion. And guardrail 5 on this slide is about having a human in the loop. So this guardrail ensures that your accountable people are suitably trained and competent to oversee, intervene, and ensure that responsible AI use through your system's lifecycle. To highlight how this standard includes advice for contracts, this is an area where you can ensure clear responsibilities are documented regarding governance and oversight in your contracts with your suppliers. All right. Guardrail 6 and 7 set up principles for transparency and contestability. So Guardrail 6 is about communicating to stakeholders when AI systems are affecting them, which you can do through either policy measures, how do you communicate externally, or there are technology standards that are currently being discussed around identifying when content is generated by AI. Ideally, you want to seek to communicate with sufficient transparency to your stakeholders that your use of AI is safe and responsible. Guardrail 7 is about how do you establish processes for people impacted by AI systems to challenge use or outcomes. So how will you address their concerns if this comes up? Have you documented a process? Have you assigned accountable people? And are you regularly reviewing how well this is working? Guardrail 8 helps you be transparent across the AI supply chain. So this is about setting up a dialogue between deployers and developers. So sharing, testing, and training data, identifying where there are areas of potential model bias, for example. It's setting up a framework for responsibility and accountability between the partners who are developing and deploying AI systems, which is ideally, again, documented in your contracts. Guardrail 9 is about keeping and maintaining records. I'm not sure how exciting I can make record keeping, but it's certainly important to you and your organization, so it gets a nod here. And finally, guardrail number 10 is about how do you identify, by engaging your stakeholders, how do you identify potential harms, unintended consequences, the negative effects of unwanted bias, accessibility, and so much more by engaging widely and regularly. This is the only guardrail that differs, I'll note, between the voluntary and the mandatory guardrails. And this is for the simple reason that the 10th mandatory proposed guardrail is around conformity assessments, and you can't mandate conformity for a voluntary standard. Okay, folks, that's the end of my introduction. So I hope that's given you a quick high-level primer of the various parts of the AI safety standard. There's, of course, a lot of depth within this underneath, but right now I would love to introduce our excellent panel, starting with Dr. Liming Zhu. Dr. Liming Zhu is Research Director in Software and Computational Systems at Data61, as we mentioned earlier, which is part of CSIRO. Liming's got years of experience in the area of responsible and ethical AI, has served on many international and national committees relating to artificial intelligence, so he's got a wealth of experience to draw to bear here. Liming, I'd like to open up for you by asking that we know that many Australian businesses operate internationally, and of course, international alignment was a priority for this work. So can you talk to us about how this framework aligns with the variety of international frameworks that exist overseas?
Yeah, thanks, Brett, and then thanks for having me, having this opportunity to explain some of the international alignment of this piece of work. As Brett said, it's really very important. We don't want to have some standards in Australian that people have to do it, but then when you are exporting or dealing internationally, you have a different set of them. So to understand that, I think it's very important to understand the different types of international work. You may have heard a lot of things in international standards set by ISO, IEEE, principles, ethics frameworks, playbooks, guidance. It can be very confusing, but to break it down, so the first type of thing is really different communities, countries, and regions are setting goals and principles for what they want to achieve. So what sort of principles, what sort of important quality attributes of the AI system, human values you want to value. And I think there needs some diversity in that. And some people ask, why there can't be a one international one? Why each country have to develop one? I think because countries and regions have different culture, have different priority, have different interpretation of the words. So that's very welcoming, very good sign that different community stakeholder groups like First Nations have developed that. You can see UN, G7, OECD, and the World Economic Forum, they all have different stakeholders, a different subset of the international landscape to come up with this one. And Australian did the AI ethics framework back in 2019 for that reason. So for that, I think what we want to do is to make sure Australia's AI safety standards reflect Australia's AI ethics framework while influencing and in harmonization with the region and the international effort. But we're not seeking one single one internationally. Once you set the goals and the principles, you want to say how to achieve that. For achieving something, a very safe AI system, you can look at it from different angles. You can have a high-level governance and management process for organization to achieve that. For the AI engineers on the ground, they all have technical processes to achieve that. And also, once you develop the AI product, you can also test the product, test artifacts, test the model of the product. So obviously, there are different ways of achieving that. In the ideal world, for some very simple technology, you may say, let's forget about the processes. You have an AI product, you have a technology, let's just test it. What's the criteria of testing? What's the threshold of passing that test? Once it's passed the test, yes, you can release on the market, it's safe. However, AI is a very complex technology. You cannot guarantee its quality, its safety, just by doing product-driven, service-driven testing. You have to look at the processes. And as I said earlier, there's the organizational process, governance management process, and also technical processes. As Brett mentioned earlier, this particular standard or this version of the standard is really looking at the process, the governance and the management process side of the standards. Once you understand that, that you can see why there are so many references to other international standards in this particular document. For example, the ISO 42001, the AI management process standards. In terms of US, NIST, their national standards body have released the AI risk management framework. There are concrete references into individual practices within that. So that's an element of alignment with this governance and management standards. And you have also probably seen in the reference section, there's a UK government guidelines for AI procurement, which is very important for many of the AI deployers to look at the procurement because you're not developing everything from yourself. So that's the mapping with concrete standards. However, the other types of standards is important. If you go to ISO's AI standard setting, you will see dozens of standards being right now developed. And how do we deal with that? Of course, management process standards are not sufficient. And in the future version of Australia's AI safety standard, we're going to address that. But by integrating some of the early signs of practice in technical processes and the products such as testing into our version 1 of the standards. It gives you some foreshadowing, some kind of signposting of the things to come at a sufficient high level. You can start doing something. That's why we have integrated. If you look at the details of each of the guardrail, the elaboration part of it, you will see quite a number of quite detailed, sometimes resemble a technical process standard, sometimes resembles a particular product-like standards requirements. But we are not prescribing that. We are pointing to the things you need to look for, because after all, if you want to just read this one and have people to know what exactly to do or look for, those information is going to be very important. And that alignment is also with international ISO, IEEE, and a number of the international standards in that regard. Another international standards we are monitoring very closely, of course, is the standards within the EU AI Act. So recently, the standards body within EU AI Act have released many characteristics of their AI standards. For example, those standards are in support of the EU AI Act. Means certain standards, including Australia's AI safety standards, could be in a supporting role of the regulatory guardrails if the government and the community decide so. So how to support a potential guardrail? That's why the mapping is very, very, very aligned in terms of mapping. It's also in the EU AI Act standards, it wants to eventually orientate the standards towards AI systems and products, because they feel governance and management processes itself is not going to be enough, and we are going to develop a more robust system and products standards. So that's why some of the alignment through signposting in these standards are there, and also applicable to all the sectors. We have a very sector agnostic view of this, and that's also aligns with many of the horizontal international AI standards, such as the EU AI Act related standards. Another major commitment or community we are participating for alignment is with the International AI Safety Institute network. As you may have heard, probably half dozen countries around the world, US, UK, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, have established an AI Safety Institute to develop practice, concrete science and practice to better do AI safety support. And that network of institutes, including Australian, which although we do not officially have an AI safety institute, but we are part of this small community. And the very first international gathering of that is going to be end of November, that Australian will be heavily participating in understanding what are the concrete practices for AI standards emerging from the International AI Safety Institute's actions. One thing I do want to point out is Australian standards may look a bit different with international frameworks, if you're familiar with that, but the difference was not there to be inconsistent. So you can see a number of different types of difference. One is really to look at to make some of the terms very clear, because are we talking about the AI system, or we are talking about AI model, are we talking about developers or deployers, and all this needs to be clarified from the terms and because different international standards have different target audience. Another one is really around some of the additional integration of the very valuable information from the international standard landscape, as I mentioned earlier, from technical processes to product practices. How do we put those things as much as possible in the first version of the standards without too much details, but also give you some guidance on what to do? So this integration through elaboration on details may have shown some differences, but it's a good thing. Everybody needs a bit more how-to guide. You don't want to just have a one sentence at the guardrail level and don't know what that means exactly. And very in a very positive way, Australia is also leading many of the effort in this space, from both industry leading and also some of the research organizations involved in it across the field of governance and human rights, testing, and some of the responsible AI engineering practices that this one is doing. The final thing that we are very proud of, it's not an alignment, it's again as a leadership, is probably Australian is making these standards quite unique in two ways. One is it is very SME, small and medium enterprise friendly. Many of the international standards may assume the users of these standards are large organizations, have many committees, have executive teams, have chief ex-officers to look after this. But many small and medium enterprises do not have those. So we have deliberately made this SME friendly so that most of the SMEs are going to be AI deployers. That's why even the first version is on AI deployment rather than AI developers. But some of the SMEs are also AI system developers using third-party models. So we are making that part of the blood of the standards. The other one is really diversity and First Nation perspective. If you have read the standards, that has First Nation perspective embedded everywhere, and we have done that through consultation. So diversity and the First Nation perspective is another thing that we are leading in these standards internationally. Hopefully other countries take up on that as well. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liming, and thank you for that great overview of how this aligns with international standards, and particularly, I love the stuff at the end around the uniquely Australian approaches to focusing on our First Nations approach, and that we've got a large number of SMEs in this country, right? Next, I'll throw to Myfanwy Wallwork. I'll remind you, Myfanwy is AI governance lead at the Human Technology Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. Hi, Myfanwy. Myfanwy's got huge amounts of experience in developing tools to help organisations understand and develop their compliance with multiple and various legal frameworks. So, Myfanwy, I think to frame this up for you, the government was careful to build out these guardrails with a human-centred focus. Can you explain to our audience here, what does that mean and why is that important?
Yeah, thanks very much, Brett. So I think there's 4 principles that we really wanted to keep in mind as we develop the standards. So protecting people, incorporating diversity, inclusion and fairness, human-centered design, and trustworthy AI systems. So if I can break those down a little bit, the first one is probably the most important. There's a lot of information and hopefully action-oriented information about identifying risks and harms and mitigations as you deploy AI systems. But really at the heart of that is protecting people, our physical and personal safety and our rights, whether that's a right to a job opportunity, privacy, healthcare, life. I think those are all really important, especially in the context of AI, which does, for some systems and models, have quite significant differences to traditional software. It's more powerful, dynamic, it's fast. It can often be opaque. So that was definitely the centre principle. Then we have diversity, inclusion and fairness. The standard does centre on the protected attributes like race and gender, but I think if you're putting together a team to consider deployment, procurement, and development in version 2, you also need diversity of perspective, diversity of experience. We've all seen, very, very serious consequences where you do not have either a representative data set or a diverse team developing AI systems, and the deployers are often that last call there. So, for example, medical devices in the US that we used during COVID, oximeters detecting the amount of oxygen in people's blood, were not as accurate for people of colour or people with darker skin. And obviously that had huge impacts on their health and in fact their life, if you thought I was over-egging that earlier, talking about that particular right. But I think it's also, a really interesting point on diversity and inclusion was something that was raised by Dr. Alondra Nelson when she was out recently in Australia. She's been working with the Biden and Harris administration on things like the executive order and AI policy. And she talked about that often when a system is being developed, minoritized groups may not want to participate in something that might be used against them to entrench historical bias. So I think it's also worth considering what diversity and inclusion means for different stakeholders, which does lead me on to the third element, which is human-centered design. Guardrail 10 is all about this, and not just engaging with your stakeholders. We're really careful to think about how to understand and evaluate needs, and of course, how to mitigate harms that are identified during that process. So this could be your employees, your shareholders, your customers, or anyone who could be impacted by the use of an AI system. And again, not just about identifying those needs, it's an ongoing process, and it's something that's really important, I think, and I'm really glad it made it into Guardrail 10. The fourth element is trustworthy systems. I've had a lot of conversations recently about the difference between trusted and trustworthy. And I think trustworthy is the right word in this context. We know that there's a huge gap in how much people trust AI systems. It's usually about 2/3 of people do not trust AI systems, which means they don't trust private sector, government to deliver appropriate products and services that protect and in fact enhance their human rights. But the good news, I think, is that even a greater number of people actually trust in the responsible and safe principles of AI. And that's exactly what the standard is based on. So the standard draws on the federal government's AI ethical principles. And as Liming and Brett, you've both described, ISO 42001, NIST, it's aligned to Australian laws and principles. So it really can be that standalone document to develop the trust internally with your employees, but also with our wider community and, of course, our customers. So I think, it's been really well covered, the international alignment and why that's really important. Of course, it is about Australian organisations operating in the international economy and removing barriers for international organisations to operate here. But that alignment really makes sense as well when we've seen the challenge for regulators in terms of a technology that is borderless, asserting jurisdiction, and then of course, even if that bar is cleared, then you have to be concerned about following through on enforcement. So aligning with things like the Bletchley Declaration, aligning with ISO and NIST, and of course Australian laws is really important. And again, taking all those principles and turning them into something actionable is what I hope we've achieved with version 1 of the standard. One final point, I think, and again, it just goes back to that central principle, protecting people. There are all kinds of harms that can happen to people using any kind of system, AI or otherwise. But if I could just highlight, I guess, a couple of examples, you can, when you're doing your stakeholder engagement, you can look at harms individually, at a group level, and at our societal level. So individual could be something like someone missing out on a job opportunity because of algorithmic bias, or being denied a government service because of automated decision making. And that actually can be reflected at a group level when bias is being entrenched by the use of a system. At our societal level, we have seen AI being used in electoral and democratic processes across the world, both good and bad. And the particular concern here, I think, is misinformation and disinformation. And a narrative that's coming to the fore that I think is concerning is where people are now saying it doesn't matter if it's true, it matters if it feels true. And I think that's something we really have to unpack as we develop AI systems. We really want people to be able to trust that something is real, that has their human rights at the centre, and is something that will be monitored and tested to protect those human rights in an ongoing manner.
Thank you so much, Myfanwy. That was a great underline of the importance of humanity in this whole process. Absolutely. Finally, I'll throw to Ali Akbari, who I'll remind you is Director of AI Practice at Gradient Institute. And Ali's had 20 years of practical and applied AI experience leading AI implementation programs for business and government. And he also participates in the development of ISO AI standards as an AI committee member for Standards Australia. So Ali, to frame you up, we heard earlier that the Australian standard provides unique benefits in the inclusion of sort of the how-to guidance approach. I wondered if you could reflect on the importance of providing clarity as organisations consider moving their principles into practice, and what are we doing in that space to help?
Thanks, Brett, and thanks for having me. Yeah, absolutely. So I agree, and what we observe both in the market and within the organizations, there is this challenge between, well, after having these principle-based governance, then what's next? How can we implement it in practice? And in lots of conversations that we have with the other organizations, they might have already some high-level policies or guidelines, and then the next step is how can we make it more practical and bridge that gap between the high-level governance and the technical teams. Gradient Institute has been trying to do this connection between the three research, policy, and practice for a couple of years so far. And an example of these sort of steps towards more practicality is the effort that National AI Center and Gradient Institute had together last year to convert the Australia's ethics principle to a practical approach with a list of tools and approaches to actually implement that. If I can refer to more specifically to this Voluntary AI Safety Standard, we have been trying to bring the same lens and the same approach of practicality to the standard. HTI, Data 61, and Gradient Institute, with the good support from National AI Center, we did extensive engagement with the industry and explored what are those specific details that can help better them to implement this. If I refer to and call out some of the specific guardrails, I can refer to, for example, the importance of the first guardrail, which is accountability, that will open the door to lots of the follow-up requirements and enable them to actually practically implement that. Then an important site is the testing guardrail, with lots of details on how actually you can prepare and test your AI systems to ensure they are in line with other requirements within this standard. So clear definition of the criteria based on the impact assessment that you have done previously, and communicating the right expectations between the system owners and the technical developing teams, as well as right test levels with the details, including the external testers and auditors, and also how to keep monitoring these AI systems remain within the expected guardrails. And also, if I can further emphasize, another one of the guardrails will be the guardrail number 8, the transparency, which will help to make sure there is a good alignment between the technical team, between the business owners, the legal team, as well as all of the stakeholders and the customers who might be impacted by these AI systems. Additionally, this standard tried to bring very clear examples and guidelines in order to further clarify what does it mean with those practical examples if you want to implement these guardrails, and also what are the benefits that it can bring to you after the implementation. If I can emphasize on one more point is the difference between the organizational level and the system level view within the standard. It has been clarified early in the standard that there are both views, both the org level and the system level. And it's important to consider and recognize where some of the requirements are specifically targeting the systems and where some of these requirements are more aligned with the organizational level and the governance processes. So, and finally, if I further emphasize what was already mentioned, lots in Liming's explanations, and then followed up in Myfanwy's clarification, in the next version, currently in version 1, there is a big focus on the deployer side and those who are basically mostly adopting these technologies. But in the next step, we want to expand and increase the clarity on the technical requirements with a focus on the roles of those developers and how the roles and responsibilities between the developers and deployers will be better managed. We can see and we observe that constantly this whole supply chain of AI systems is getting more and more complex. And the line between developers and deployers are getting a bit more blurred. So how can we better manage this extent of roles and responsibilities, and which requirements will more specifically apply to the developer side and which requirements will apply to the deployer side, and how can they communicate and clarify the boundaries between themselves.
Thank you so much, Ali.
Wrap it up to have some more time for the question and answering.
Indeed, and we'll bring all of our panel on screen now so that we can get some answers to the questions that are flooding in, folks. There is a bunch of questions here in the chat. We have so many that I don't think we'll manage to get to them in time, but we will be answering questions in text as we go along. And I mentioned that we will also try to follow up if it's something that needs a more comprehensive answer, we'll attempt to follow up. But again, all of these questions are great. Please keep them coming. The Q&A button is at the top of your screen, the little question mark thought bubbles there. And it all definitely helps inform version 2 of the standard. So I think I will start by throwing a question to Liming from Erwin, which I think is a great question. Basically, why is AI different in this case, Liming? Erwin says he doesn't disagree with the principles and guardrails in principle, but we seem to go overboard with AI. If we apply these principles and guardrails to other products and services in Australia, most of them won't pass the test. And while I understand that AI can heighten risks, so can other products and services such as gambling and pesticides and so on. What do you think about that, Liming?
Yeah, certainly AI quite unique. As we know, AI is much more autonomous. It's not a typical type of technology and tool. It's a cognitive intelligence type of capability. And the way we manage that needs to be different. At the very top level, as I said, responsible innovation, responsible technology, the same principles should apply to everything. I fully agree with that. But when it comes to how, I think the reason we're spending so much time is the how is not very clear. To some organizations, it's new. You don't have a lot of AI digital skills. For other spaces like the generative AI, some of the large language models are new technologies, not even its own AI designers and developers fully understand how to mitigate all the risk. So there's a lot of co-invention, and those co-invention and the development of best practice need to be working together with the industry. It's not going to be some regulatory body, standards body, or research organization telling industry what to do, but the industry coming back to say, we have tried this guardrails and things, it doesn't work, or it's the best way to assure that guardrail works in this way. That's why this standards is a living standard. This standards, the primary purpose is to test with the industry. When you try to use it, let us know, let the wider community know how it's working and share that practice back.
Fantastic answer, thank you. Ali, you look like we want to chip in there too.
If I can add a little bit more on that, about why more specifically AI. I think AI systems have specific and unique characteristics that brings a different risk profile to them. And if you add on top of that the scale and speed of AI systems, it will heighten the whole risk level. And that's why it needs more specific further attention. And the whole aim of this standard is bring that knowledge and best practices on where can you focus in order to ensure you have managed it properly.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that, that some systems can have unplanned or unintended consequences is quite a significant difference for some AI systems as well.
Thank you so much. You've neatly teed up one of the other questions that's in the chat here from Morton Ilog, and I think I'll throw to Ali first in the first instance around this one. Are there any standard best practice templates organizations can adopt for AI risk assessment criteria? Initiatives are often really only known as at the high level at the start of the cycle, and so more specific, it's framed up as if we don't know all the specifics, but of course you deepen this understanding over time. So helping companies on their journey implementing the guardrails, I think, is the thrust of the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually there are a lot rather than is there any. I think Liming already listed and referenced a couple of them. And another thing maybe worth to emphasize is this Voluntary AI Safety Standard, for example, references the ISO 42001. And that is quite high level standard. However, ISO has already published 30 more other standards specifically related to AI. So one of them being risk management for AI systems. These additional standards are some resources that can add more details into how more specifically, for example, treat the risk management. As well as I can remind again the report that I referenced about the activity between the report that was developed by National AI Center and Gradient Institute about the implementing AI ethics principles, which a new version of that is coming up hopefully soon.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of, if anything, I agree, there's almost too much guidance out there. And the feedback that we're definitely hearing at the National AI Centre is, can we help simplify this down? Can we help make this easier for businesses to implement? And it's one thing that we're going to continue to release resources for over time to help say, if you do these things, these will help you align with these international standards. And here's the relevant tools and things for your journey. We can talk more about that coming up soon, I'm sure. So any other panelists who want to throw in on that, or we're happy to take another question?
Yeah, I think
the best.
You go, Liming.
I think the best also answer that in the chatbot in some way, because the National AI Center just released the Impact Navigator. It's a form of risk assessment, I think, and also the ESG and AI risk. There's another very wonderful guidebook for risk assessment. It's not one single risk assessment template, but many of the tools are available right now, provided by National AI Center, but also internationally.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I guess it's more of the challenge that you are bringing different existing templates together, like privacy, impact, and risk assessment, with the particular specific characteristics of AI, and considering things like who's going to be impacted and what that means for them as well. So yeah, applaud NAIC for trying to bring those in a simple digitized version as well, because yes, the challenge is that there are a lot, not enough.
Myfanwy, I think the next question would be best addressed to you in the first instance, but I'm sure the other panelists will have some lens on this. What do we think, thinking about this from the consumer experience side of this, right? Are we imagining that we're going to end up with something similar to the GDPR experience, where you have these cookie pop-ups that are everywhere on websites nowadays, where you've got to toggle things on and off, which of course causes consent fatigue and people to phase them out? How do we think this looks for the consumer side?
Yeah, that really builds on the previous question really well. I think we've seen, those pop-ups, everyone agrees with everything, everyone just accepts them, they're not really sure what's going to be used. And then we find out later that Clearview AI has used it to create profiles of people, which can be used for various different good and bad purposes. So I think, again, it goes back to a point about trusted and trustworthy as well. Like I saw recently, one of the social media companies has released a whole lot of controls that are supposed to address the concerns people have around addiction and marketing to children. But actually what it's found is that that's not affecting those real world outcomes. So it's not actually increasing the trustworthiness of the system. It's just increasing the trusted nature of the system. So we do need to work out something. If you have to let everyone know you're using an AI system, to what level does that mean? I think it does get down to that use case, that high risk, low risk. And I think that's something I hope that we can provide further guidance on in version 2.
All right. On a quick answer for one of the obvious questions that always comes up with these things, yes, this is being recorded and it will be provided after the session for everybody as well. So, okay, there's a question from Daniel Stewart. And I think this is probably best addressed to Liming or Ali. So we'll start with Liming, and Ali, I'm sure you'll chip in. App developers will be pulling from existing models such as OpenAI's ChatGPT, Claude, and so on and so forth. And maybe you can talk to the separation of responsibilities, what we're talking about as far as version 2 of the standard, between the model builders and then the app developers that are consuming the model. So it's kind of the whole piece around the development is sometimes including companies external to Australia, I think is the thrust there.
Yes, so this first version is focusing on AI deployers. And the next version is going to be both on AI model builders, but also system app developers, because many of the SMEs are taking a third-party model, and different people have different responsibility. But in all of them, including the current version, there is the procurement side of it. If you are procuring from some upstream ones, you can ask the right questions. Many of the guardrails probably is best for them to address. The overall thinking is the risk needs to be managed across the supply chain. It's not one party says I can remove all the risks of this particular type, because downstream developers and users do have additional context information. you are getting more information into the system to ask questions, your prompt, your knowledge around your prompt, that also changes the model behavior. So it's across the board, but then different players will have different techniques to do that because you have different information and you probably sometimes have different digital and AI skills. So that's has been taken care of. But I think it's a shared responsibility across the supply chain and how for each different players.
Yeah, maybe I just quickly add in addition to confirming again what Liming said about that should be a shared responsibility across the supply chain. I have to also acknowledge that we understand there are these challenges of it's difficult to push that responsibility up that supply chain. So it also relates to the previous question and discussion about, are this going to cause all of the responsibility fall on the end users just to review all of the fine prints and accept or reject? So we are conscious of that, and especially, for example, when smaller SMEs in Australia are dealing with larger tech providers as the developers, it might be difficult to negotiate and set those boundaries. Therefore, having that in mind, that we'll try to approach the second version and set the scene in a way that as much as possible, it's clearly pushing the responsibilities separate between the deployers and developers.
Thanks so much, both. Myfanwy, the next question actually will probably pull this into your area of expertise, which is around, so the commenter is Emma, and she mentioned that you picked up on your need for consultation with groups impacted by AI. And so Emma's asking, this puts the burden on groups to identify and communicate the risks of AI. And so have we got mechanisms to enable knowledge brokerage, essentially, for marginalized or impacted groups to ideally reduce consultation fatigue, make sure we get fair outcomes out of this?
Yeah, I think this is such a great question because stakeholder engagement is so important, but it is both a burden on smaller organisations and on the people who could be impacted by these systems. And that's why I think we really need to work out a way, whether it's like government-sponsored consultation groups where people are actually paid for their time, that you do get that diverse perspective, but also things like approved use cases. I'm not saying approved technologies, that is too wide and too big, but if we can get down to a version where people know it's okay to use this system for this purpose, I think that will reduce the fatigue both on small organisations and on other external stakeholders like individuals like us.
Great answer, thank you. We are approaching time and I'm going to have to wrap up, but I'm just going to ask one more question of our panel because we've been talking a lot about risks and harms, but of course there's a good reason to believe that AI will do a lot to enhance the lives of Australians. So maybe anyone who wants to chip in, I'll start with Myfanwy because you have the speaking stick right now, but anyone who wants to chip in about some of the AI applications you're most excited about, perhaps.
Look, I'm really disappointed I still don't have a robot housekeeper, and I feel that, cartoons of earlier ages lied to me. But I'm honestly really excited about the emergence of AI in healthcare. Like every day you see, cancer can be diagnosed more quickly and therefore treatment put in places more quickly. I think there's a great opportunity there. And anything that sifts through the amazing amount of AI governance and technology on a daily basis would be super helpful as well.
Where's my robot housekeeper? Thank you very much. Liming.
Of course, coming from the National Science Agency, I'm mostly excited about scientific discovery, AI accelerating that. Imagine rather than having 6,000 of CSIRO scientists, their productivity has tenfold increase, or you have 6 million scientists. Imagine the type of things, the problem you can solve. And CSIRO is definitely building that type of AI scientist, a co-pilot for scientists with responsible AI safety in the mind. So that's the most exciting thing.
And Ali.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there are many, and it's difficult for me to choose, but if I want to mention one, I think we have the digital divide concern. And in one way, I understand AI and more complexity is bringing a bit more concern about, is this gap going to be bigger? However, on the other side, with all of these new advancements of AI and simplicity of using it, I see it can actually help to bridge that gap, make the digital divide even hopefully smaller. And I already see, for example, lots of interesting potential of the productivity improvements for example, non-for-profits who are under the pump with limited resources and big missions. They want to achieve a lot, and they have a lot of limitations. And I'm very hopeful that we can leverage these AI capabilities further towards that direction.
Thank you so much, everybody. I would like to definitely thank our wonderful panel here, Ali Akbari, Myfanwy, Wallwork, and Liming Zhu. I'm just going to wrap us up here, folks, because we're approaching the hour. It's flown by. There are many, many more questions than we've had a chance to answer, including some specifics around guardrails. So we are taking all of this input. Thank you so much. If one of my team can pull the slide deck back up, because we've just got a couple of extra things that were mentioned through that discussion there that I think will potentially help people implementing these things. All right. Let me just see if we can hop ahead. All right, so in closing, I will talk about a couple of additional tools that we've got for coming up down the pipe. But of course, we mentioned multiple times, next steps here are that we are going to be working on version 2, of course, of the safety standard, which involves AI developers. And so the idea is to help create a product that is safe by design and really spread the responsibilities for implementing safe and responsible AI across the whole life cycle. So as mentioned, this is going to take the 10 principles that we had as part of the first version and build on them and give really developer-specific guidance involved there. In addition, other aspects that we have coming down the pipe. So we had a couple of reports released in the last couple of weeks that our lovely panelists mentioned. So we have an AI in ESG report, and this is AI and ESG functions have significant overlap. This is a practical guide to really help experts better understand the implications and opportunities of AI in their framing, how it aligns with and even fits into ESG frameworks within your organization. And the AI Impact Navigator on the right of screen builds on the Voluntary AI Safety Standard. So it's some of that more deep information that our questions and commenters are asking for. And this is really letting organizations think more broadly about the outcomes that their AI has on their customers, their investors, the workforce, and the broader community. With that, folks, we are at time. For the people who asked where they could get more information about future releases and other things like this, here is your best way to find us. Follow us on LinkedIn or connect to our mailing list through the links on this slide. We absolutely are regularly communicating across these channels and always trying to also spread the good news about the awesome work that the Australian AI industry is doing. Please reach out and connect to us if you have any further questions. We are always responsive to questions on our inbox. And thank you, everybody, for a wonderful session today. I'll speak to you later. Thank you.
Thank you.